About to be joined by Monica. She'll be joining us in just a second. Hopefully third time is the charm. 1 second as she joins us. Monica joins us. Hopefully third time is the charm for us. About to start. Amazing.
Okay, success. My apologies.
No worries. Instagram. It's third time's the charm, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for your patience and thanks for having me on today.
Thank you for joining us. Before we jump in and talk a little bit about what to expect on an adoption journey, do you mind just introducing yourself to the HTICFA community?
Of course. My name is Monica Baker, and I am the Senior Director of Domestic Adoption at Spence Chapin Services to Families. We are an adoption organization that's been around for over 100 years, really serving the United States. We do domestic and international adoption, but we are here in New York City and also New Jersey, and we recently became licensed in Arizona as well.
Amazing. That's awesome.
So I will be mostly speaking about domestic adoption today, but I'm happy to also touch base about foster care adoption and intercountry adoption as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I guess we're going to start a bit broad with some questions that we received, but can you give us an overview of, I know that no two journeys are identical, but that along many journeys there are similar experiences or milestones that one may experience from starting, calling, deciding that this is the journey one wants to pursue, to meeting one's child, and everything in between. So can you maybe walk us through what, I don't want to say typical because I know there's no such thing as typical, but what a journey might look like, what an intended parent should expect along this process?
Absolutely. And thank you for leading with, just an acknowledgement that it probably looks so different for every family.
Yeah.
Because it does. But I would say the first step is really just learning about the different pathways, learning about different agencies that might be licensed in your area, different attorneys who are well versed in adoption, and learning about the different pathways if you are exploring foster care or intercountry adoption. An adoption journey is often one that takes some time, and so these professionals that you partner with are going to be in your lives for a long time, maybe years, and through something that's obviously so personal and sensitive. So it's just really important to do your research, make sure that you're selecting the right providers, talk to other families that have worked with those professionals. So that's number one. And then really the first step to any home study, whether you're doing domestic, intercountry, foster care, every family needs to go through what's called a home study process. And that essentially is an assessment of your family, just to make sure that you are an appropriate family for a child to be placed with. But I really look at it more as like an educational process, and really just beginning to think of some of these concepts about adoption and the things that are a bit unique to adoptive parenting. And so much of adoption is adoptive parenting is just parenting, period, but there are some unique things to take into account and really explore. And not only are you being assessed by the agency, but it's also a bit of a self-assessment and really exploring what your capacities are as a parent.
Amazing.
And beyond that, then it turns into like the waiting part of the process. So I think that's the part that can be really trying for a lot of folks. I'll speak to domestic adoption. It's a birth parent driven process. So it's really unpredictable how long a family's wait will be. But ultimately, I really encourage families to just have faith in the process, and ultimately the child that's supposed to end up in your family will find his or her way there.
For sure. Sure. And so you described, I'm going to backtrack a little bit to your initial introduction of how you focus mostly on domestic adoption, but that there are other options within the adoption community of a path one could choose. Can you differentiate between those three that you described?
Sure thing. So, domestic infant adoption is typically going to be done either through an adoption agency like the one that I am with, Spence Chapin, or a private attorney. And those are often referred to as private adoptions. And that means that it's not through the public system versus if you are adopting through the foster care system, you're going to be going through the state. And adoption, whether you do private or public, it's going to be state to state. And then an inter-country adoption would refer to any time that you're adopting a child from another country. And in those circumstances, there's an immigration process that's part of an adoption process as well. For a domestic private adoption, it's typically a birth parent is making a voluntary adoption plan with an adoptive family, and then through the foster care system, it may be a scenario that the birth parent's rights were terminated, sometimes involuntarily.
And we had recently, someone had mentioned that there is a difference between the oversight and agency experiences within the adoption process versus a concierge who may support someone through that journey. Can you differentiate between, or not, I guess, better question, can you explain a little bit about the oversight that is happening within the adoption agency process from the state?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And an agency is going to be licensed or accredited through, usually through the state. But that's a really important thing to consider because there are some entities that are unlicensed facilitators who are collecting a fee and helping families go through an adoption process and not really providing any types of like social services or counseling to the birth parent. So we encourage you to just be careful of adoption facilitators because those are the unlicensed entities versus an adoption agency that is like following the regulations that are put forth by the state to protect everybody involved.
Right. And one question that we received was, you had mentioned that there's that waiting period. And I know, again, as we said earlier, that there's no such thing as a typical, but what is the span of time from the shortest to the longest that families wait to be placed with a child?
Sure. Yeah, it can be anywhere from a few months to a few years, and really everything in between. I think that that's going to depend on the pathway that you choose. And it's also going to be influenced somewhat by what you're open and flexible to as a prospective parent. And, I think that's a really important part of any family's home study process is really looking within and thinking through what are some of the risk factors and unknowns and known factors that we're going to be comfortable with as we become parents and in our parenting journey and assessing that. And certainly like the more flexible you are, that might impact your weight. Like you might have a shorter weight if you're open to more different kinds of opportunities versus if you have a more specific request for the child that you hope to bring into your family.
For sure, and that makes a lot of sense. And you had mentioned at the beginning the home study. Can you describe a little bit more about what a home study process looks like, what one might want to prepare in advance of one, and some tips for how to both emotionally and practically be ready for that?
Sure. Yeah, so a home study is ultimately it's a written document that is required, and they're a little bit different state to state, but every state will require one. There's a lot of paperwork that will need to be collected, which is things like, you know, your references, personal references recommending you, birth certificates, documents like that. It would always include like a criminal background history check, as well as like a child abuse clearance, medicals, financial information. All of that type of information is gathered with documents. So that's kind of one phase of it. And then the rest is like interviews with a social worker, and one of those, at least one of those, is going to need to happen in your home because they will need to see the environment in which the child will be placed. But it's really, again, also like an educational process, and, you know, thinking through what the needs of the child that's going to be joining your home it may have. And I would say that a home study process can take anywhere from a few weeks to maybe 4 to 6 months.
And are they conducted through the agency, or are they done third party?
Most agencies will offer home study services. Some states do allow for independent social workers to conduct home studies. My recommendation there would be to go for an agency home study, because depending on where your match occurs, they might not take a home study conducted by an independent social worker.
And that's a wonderful piece of advice. One more question, and want to be sensitive to your time. You had mentioned, sorry, my thought process just, I'm going to skip that question and I'm going to go to something else. What do's and don'ts do you recommend for anyone going through this process in terms of, as they enter it, many individuals coming off of a fertility journey, potentially one in which ART was not the path that they were going to successfully pursue to parenthood, in terms of the mental health component of the process. I know that you mentioned that there are mental health professionals that you work with when you go through an agency process, versus the lack thereof when not using an agency. Is there any advice of the mental health state one should be in before they walk through your doors?
Yeah, that's an important thing for any family moving towards an adoption process to consider. And, you know, it's going to be so individual and so personal for any family that is transitioning from a fertility journey to an adoption journey. And I would say it's really important to keep in mind that there are many variables, and not unlike with a fertility journey, that are just so out of one's control. But I think that can kind of be layered on top of already having experienced that with going through an assisted reproductive journey. I would say that it's really important to, you know, just be mindful of that this is usually going to be like an unexpected, unplanned pregnancy on the behalf of the birth parent. So there are often unknowns in that. And, you know, she may have a late awareness of the pregnancy. There are different risk factors that you will be asked to consider. And, you know, we know that families come to adoption just wanting to become parents, and, you know, knowing that they'll be great parents, and then having to go through all of these steps and, you know, an assessment, and then, you know, having to ask these really difficult questions about, like, oh gosh, is this something that, you know, we feel comfortable taking on as parents? And that's incredibly difficult. But I encourage families to, it can be helpful to shift from, you know, just the mindset of like wanting to become parents, but also looking at it from the child's perspective and taking into account that there is often loss on all sides in adoption, on the child's end and the prospective parents end, and also the birth parents end. And going into this process and even ongoing as you become parents, this is going to be something that comes up. So it's important to be aware of that and mindful of.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Before we end, do you have any last piece of advice or something that you would like to leave people with as they're contemplating this and learning about the process?
Absolutely. It's always going to be somewhat of a leap of faith, and, probably putting behind you some expectations that you had about your parenthood journey. But it's, ask any adoptive parent and they will tell you that it's worth it and that they're glad that they made that stretch.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time and answering the questions, and apologies for all the background noise. And yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure getting on Instagram Live with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thanks for your patience in letting us try it 3 times.
Sure thing. I think I learned a thing or two about Instagram Live. So have a good one.
Amazing. You too.
Bye-bye.